in the academic world. However, I don't know if you're like me, you start to get a sense of, there has to be more. How can I contribute to the way, to development, especially in a place like Nigeria, where seriously, there's a lot that needs to be done. And so along comes this INGSA call, which was broadly targeted. Well, I don't want to say broadly targeted, broadly aimed at researchers from the global south working on issues in any aspect of the SDGs. So I was working on energy, other people were working on resilience, issues of resilience, disaster risk management, things like that. So 6 of us then got selected globally to basically, as academics, coming from an academic place, to try to engage with the world of policy. So the brief was quite broad, so there was a lot of space within which to sort of wiggle in that. So I did that for 1 year. The proposal that I sent was framed as sort of like action research so yes, we're used to the traditional desk-based research. I'd also done some kind of participatory research work with communities in poor areas, mostly rural ones. But in terms of action research with elite groups, especially politicians or policymakers, this was going to be my first stab at it. So almost like learning by doing stakeholder engagement, meetings, things like that, interviews. And it was actually a very, very fruitful process. And so it's some of the process and the outcomes that I want to share with us today. So just to say, I'll be keeping my eye on the clock. This is a 2-hour session, but I'd like to actually break it a bit. And I'm aiming to be able to go off for about 15 minutes on top of the dot of the hour. So by 3, I'm going to be able to leave the room for maybe discussion by participants. It's possible that Dr. Shugam can help to steer that, and then I'll be back in the room by 3:15. Dr. Shugam, I hope that's okay.
Yeah, that's noted.
Okay, thank you. So I'll just crack on with it. I want to say, please sort of feel free to raise your hand, do basically anything as I'm presenting. I also like a bit of feedback. So if you have any burning issues you want to raise, feel free to raise your hand. Science, and but you can ignore like the big words. And so I don't know how many of us have got a bit of background in, probably not a lot. But I just thought maybe a little bit of intro into the sort of basics of the issue, might help to frame what it is that this project was about. So, there's the evidence that actually, when we talk of energy poverty, energy access, my field, there are 2 dimensions to it. There is access to, or the lack of access to electricity on the one hand, and then the lack of access to modern cooking energy on the other hand. Modern cooking energy meaning LPG that we're familiar with, and electricity. So and those are 2 to a very large extent almost parallel lines that until recently never actually met. So what this translates to in real terms is that if you implement an intervention or you design a policy aimed at improving electricity access, chances are, most likely it will not do anything to improve cooking and energy access. And that has serious implications, especially for women. So there's a gender component who bear a lot of the brunt, for cooking, in a culture like ours and across Africa. So only, the data says only 5% of Nigerians have access to electricity for cooking. So the rest is, kerosene, but, the vast majority, especially in rural areas, are, charcoal, wood, things like that. And that has serious impact for health, for the health and the environment as well. Of women and children, because many times children are in the kitchen or in the room wherever women are cooking and all of that. So this is an issue that touches many lives. Basically, there's millions of deaths globally that result from it every year. But policy wise, a lot of the attention, the bulk of the attention, tends to focus on rural electrification, things like that. That's even the policies that do get some kind of, traction. And so that sort of leaves cooking energy, in the lurch. If you look at, my my cover page here, it's this was in Accra. This is from a different project that I was doing. This is a woman making bank over a charcoal fire, and this is a picture that is replicated several I don't know, hundreds of thousands, million times over, in Nigeria and across the continent. So this is the the reality. Question is, how does energy policy connect or respond to this reality? And sort of the brief answer is actually not very much. And so the evidence is okay. So there's this cry, especially I don't know, from practitioners and also from academics, like cooking shouldn't kill. But in reality, it does. So if we look just quickly, briefly at this graph, what it tells us is that smoke from biomass. Biomass, by the way, is the traditional, what we call traditional fuels, wood, charcoal, and it actually kills. The smoke, inhaling the smoke from that actually kills more than all many of the other. In fact, to 2030, this other malaria, TB, and HIV deaths are projected to reduce, whereas from biomass was projected to increase between 2008 to 2030 to about 1.5 million. But actually, what has happened is that there's a review of the evidence, and as far back as 2018. Actually, this graph, became dated because actually now approximately 4 million deaths globally now. In Nigeria, it's in the order of about 100,000 deaths per year, resulting directly from exposure to cooking fuels. So, like, people are dying, right? And so basically, that's the evidence in a nutshell. And the idea, what I went in with was, so after all of this evidence, how can it be made useful, right? How can it be gathered, translated, applied? Scientific evidence, and the emphasis on scientific, for better outcomes. How can it be made to benefit, the climate, the environment, women, households? And, like I said before, so this was the main SDGs targeted. And it was action research based on real world interaction. And so the idea was to make room for multiple knowledges, if you will. So I had all this book knowledge, so to speak, from my work in the energy sector, or in the energy research sector. But I was also keen, on this project. The idea was then also to get the other side of the story, right? So from the policy side. So I had all these facts and figures and stories, So I'm a qualitative researcher as well, I should point out. So I do narratives, analysis. I do a lot of granular, sort of like the stories behind the trends and the figures and the graphs. So there's all of that. But it was also useful and interesting to hear what was going on the policy side, because that understanding is key to one shaping, sort of acts as feedback for research problems that are worth paying attention to, and can be useful, in turn to policymakers and potentially to the users of energy, around the world and in Nigeria specifically. So the main methods were then again, interviews and interactions. By interactions, it was, so basically just read into interactions, hobnobbing. There's a lot of hobnobbing with government actors, various ministries, you know, and yeah, and I was actually, I must say, completely new to this environment. But it was interesting how in actually setting out to do it, it actually didn't, it wasn't so bad, you know, it wasn't, turned out not to be as bad as maybe, you know, I might have feared as somebody coming from like an academic space, no prior, you know, connections politically or, you know, in that sort of government space. And one of the key things which I think I highlight in a later slide was the, which was, I was pleasantly surprised that was actually the willingness of government partners, government stakeholders to engage with the issues, to engage with you know, evidence, to reflect on the gaps, you know, the evidence gaps in terms of the culture of evidence use, you know, in their various ministries, and that was, you know, that was very, very encouraging and very enlightening to me, you know, as well. So apart from this, so the interviews and interactions with a few MDs, about a dozen or so of them, relevant to this topic. And then there were two workshops spaced roughly about 8 months apart or so. I think the first one was in June 2018. And the second one was a sort of more intimate, closed workshop with targeted at a higher level. Because what happened was I targeted higher level officials at the start, but eventually, you know, basically got people to send, I don't know, their assistant or their, you know, PA or something, not PA, but people who were, you know, like working, more technical people, as opposed to political, well, people that had decision-making power, you know, necessarily. But it was also useful. It was useful because that first setup enabled us to, you know, to get insight into you know, the technology, not technological necessarily alone, but the technical capacity within the MDAs, you know, before then moving on to, you know, how policy, you know, how decisions are made by the superiors. So it was very, very useful in that way. And then yes, so these were the talking points for. I just brought this out. Obviously, the workshop was a bit bigger than that. It was a half-day workshop. There were like presentations, 3 presentations by, you know, EXA. So I did a presentation. There was this is a, well, mentor of mine. So I think someone from NASETEM is here, so they will know, or at least I heard someone talk about NASETEM earlier. They will know Professor Shinyabala. He was actually my mentor on this INGSA project. And then he also did a presentation at this workshop about, you know, science, basically evidence used in science and tech policy in Nigeria, because he literally spearheaded the very first science and tech STI policy for Nigeria. So has a wealth of experience in how these things work. So he was the pioneer DG of NASETEM, and he did great work at NASETEM, continues to do great work now. And for me, very, 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 you know, happily, we had a presentation from somebody from the Rural Electrification Agency, the REA, which, so he, you know, I basically reached out to him and he's, you know, happy to present. And in these sorts of things, you know, that whole two-way, you know, so it wasn't just people from academia, all these people that just talk grammar that, you know, that were there or that were talking, you know, it was, you know, somebody from that other side to, in quotes, the government. I laid out this whole, you know, program they had for rural electrification. And like I said, remember that, you know, I had distinguished earlier about, you know, how electrification is not necessarily equivalent to cooking energy, which maybe it's not the only problem in the world, but like, as we can see from the relative weights of it, you know, if you wanted to rank or choose which might be the most urgent, just on the face of the evidence, which would appear to be more pressing. It would seem to me that it would be the cooking energy axis. But in the real world, it doesn't translate to that. There's more of an emphasis on electricity. And so at some point in all of this work, I actually literally decided to go with the flow, in the sense that I modified my questions a little bit, my starting questions. So I sort of set out intent to highlight the importance of this cooking energy issue and what the evidence says about it, right? But then sort of getting in, it wasn't, it didn't take too long before I realized that to actually get the attention of people in this space, it kind of makes sense to pay attention to what it is that they are doing first and what it is they're saying. So just basically coming in to say, you know what, this thing that you're doing, it's, not that it's wrong, nobody can fault an electrification policy. We have huge electrification problems in Nigeria, but even to say, okay, look, there's this other aspect of the thing that you're not looking at, almost at all. They will not listen, simply because they are really focused on this one thing, for several reasons linked to political economy, different energy sources and uses, which might be able to talk about a bit later. But so just strategy wise, I then modified my approach to be like, okay, so this is what you want to talk about, this is what you want to talk about, let's talk about it. So all the programs that you're doing, for electrification, and all of that, how do you engage with the evidence there, or whatever program, whether it be it electrification, be it whatever, in energy, in household energy, how do you engage with those issues? What sources, what factors do you consider? What lies behind this quote unquote policy cycle, which is just on paper. That's not the way it works in reality, but at least, what are the factors that influence policy choices? And so there was actually a very, very good engagement. I don't want to go into a lot of the technical. I just want to point out some of the more strategic connotations, of what transpired. And so you can begin to see, like if you look at the last bullet points, or even everything. So basically, what are the drivers of different policies? This was workshop 2, by the way. So this was February 2019, and basically started looking at the different, policies. So as you can see, there's actually an electrician, a gas, and a fuelwood policy. But the level of attention paid to all of these aspects is actually, in descending order. So electricity is at the top. There's a bit of momentum now around, domestic gas and all of that. But fuelwood, which is, again, it's a whole technical area, which I don't want to get into. It's really the poor cousin of all of these other people. But again, this is an area where I have been focusing my attention for nearly a decade now. And it's sort of my starting agenda was to sort of present the evidence, in this regard. But that has become a bit more muted, and I will explain how some of that has gone, going forward on the back of this. So you can see, so the framing of my questions then begin to become a bit more generic, and really trying to look at how, what the current culture around evidence use is in different relevant MDAs. And so the hypothesis being, if you are able to influence that culture and get evidence to be a part of, the considerations in policy. So, some of the interviews and interactions I had, some of the issues coming out were things like, actually, factors affecting. So if you go back to this slide, some of the factors that you consider, that first point. Almost naturally, issues of cost, which options can the government afford, or which options can more easily get funded by maybe partners or donors or private sector actors, things like that. What's the technological capacity within the country to do that? What does best practice elsewhere? So what has worked in other countries and things like that. So was a whole host of factors listed under that, but not a lot of mention, hardly any mention about just evidence, consulting, and just as a corollary to that, which I think is something that we need to engage with, maybe, I don't know, on this platform and beyond. As a corollary to that, the relatively lower status of scientific evidence correlates with the low levels of representation of researchers, academic researchers in particular, in policy making arenas, policy making, decision-making processes. And so, basically, the research pivoted to what can be done, or what can we start to do to try to begin to increase that profile. So when a policy is about to be made, or policy reviews or things like that, what will it take to get researchers, research institutions at the table, to begin to inform some of the agenda setting? Because what then happens in this specific field, it may not be the same for others, but in this specific field, what then happens is the agenda gets set a lot by private sector actors, and by their willingness to go with the program, of the government, which is not, again, this is not about everything, even including research input, all of these things, like we like to say in sociology, a lot of these things are value laden. There's no such thing as neutral, quote and unquote, inputs. Even science itself, STS, especially science and technology studies, has made a lot of strides in, literally showing how both science and policy are, value laden, and how they, sort of inform each other in that kind of dance, in this kind of deliberative processes. So, that's sort of like a given. But the idea is, so within all of these factors and value laden, things, how do you at least increase the inputs of scientific research, which or evidence, which I'm sure the academics here know, that the sort of value behind this whole impetus on evidence to policy is the fact, it really rests on the scientific method and the rigor, right, of the scientific process. So we've all been a part of this COVID saga, and how I'm not sure I've ever been confronted with a barrage of, conflicting information, from different sources, at the same time, in my life. And again, this is a bit peculiar, to a pandemic. The mechanisms are different and all of that, but the point remains that there's a lot of competing, and really you want to be able to know what basis to select the best. Even with scientific evidence, we've seen how the advice, guidance, so to say, has changed on things like, before it was not airborne, that's the coronavirus. Now it's almost certainly airborne. Before, surfaces were a major, considered a major mechanism of transmission. Now not so much. But I think that ability of the scientific method, to keep correcting itself and adjusting itself, and based on rigor, based on the evidence, is what potentially makes it a very, very valuable, and again, in the STS/sociology tradition, we don't sort of place normative or assign normative value to, science is one input. There's also culture, there's values, there's people's beliefs, and all of those are important, because you can't force science or the science down people's throats. If they believe something else, as we all know that Nigeria is a very religious and superstitious place, and those beliefs, we sort of recognize them as valid, valid, not necessarily right or wrong, but it's okay that people have those beliefs, right? Next question is, how do you engage with those beliefs, and how do you sort of try to make a case for science, which also has its own uncertainties and risks, so it's actually a more complicated picture than it might first appear, this whole science policy landscape. So this this is just, to the left is a picture of workshop one. This is a collaboratively produced, there are breakout groups, I think government, it's a bit long ago now, I have to rack my brain. So there was government, there was civil society, and there was, I think, private sector. I think this was from the government group where, just in response to these questions, this matrix was developed by, to say these are the consideration factors that they consider for choosing technologies or doing projects or doing policy. So even the process itself, basically first and I didn't give them this matrix. They were the ones that sort of filtered they interpreted the question this way, and they sort of filtered, it helped them to structure their thinking around what they do, with how they engage with evidence. And this is this second picture was workshop 2, again a bit more closed, and maybe just to say this in practical terms. So the project, I basically made the project pay for this venue. This was Transcorp Hilton in Abuja, and this was not the fullest. This just happened to be maybe one of the nicer pictures, but it wasn't the fullest. At some point, the room, including those empty chairs, they were full, and the point being, I made the project pay for this venue because it was a gimmick to try to get the top level officials of these MDAs that I was targeting. The first venue wasn't so fancy, so the second venue was, and I think that there was a difference. So I think, just practically speaking, in the context of Nigeria, and so couple of lessons, number of lessons learned. I mean, so the point about knowing your audience, I will just maybe sort of say a few anecdotes to illustrate some of these points. So this article on the left, it was something that I wrote way back in 2014, when the Federal Executive Council just literally woke up at a Wednesday meeting and voted 9.2 billion naira to provide improved cook stoves to poor rural women. Like, this was not part of any plan, not part of any policy. This was the Jonathan era. This was, without trying to make this political, because again, that's one thing. We have to try to know how to engage with policy without becoming political, which is, I suppose, good luck to us with that. But that's like the ideal. So there was this thing that just came up, and as somebody working in space, I just had to respond, to that. And then I, wrote this op-ed in the Premium Times, which is an online only paper, by the way, and it's I chose it deliberately because it's to the extent that we have a leftist agenda in Nigeria, it's left-leaning group, so all this democracy, progressive, good governance things, they try to promote it. So that's why I sent it. And You know, I felt it was, you know, I'd done my bit and all of that. Well, who knows? We don't know who reads these things. But then, so this was in 2014. But by, you know, by the time it came around to 2018, when I then started this project, I had an interview with, you know, one of the top officials in the Rural Electrification Agency then. And I basically told him about this, just in the course of engagement, you know, what we had done with this. And the first thing he said to me was, you know, who is the premium times? The government officials are trying to reach with this message. You don't go and put an op-ed targeted at a government official in, you know, in premium times. Put it in The Nation or, you know, Punch or something, you know, where, and they, you know, they read the hard copy most times. And for me, that was really poignant. It's just an illustration of how, you know, maybe I wouldn't necessarily rank those papers as the ones that I would want to read, but it's not. This is not for me. It's about the people that we're trying to, you know, get to. And so that was a lesson. Career civil servants, like I said earlier, are actually surprisingly keen to engage. So you know, well, yeah, I think here there's a certain connotation of, you know, career civil servants, but actually there was a lot of willingness to engage with the issues. And I think when I entered the room earlier, people were talking about funding. Maybe that's an issue. Maybe I'll leave it to the floor, you know, to talk about. But yes, it is a hard sell without funding for those issues. You know, and yes, really, it's really the economy and economic issues that determine what goes on. And so I think maybe the last but not the least, which I will touch upon at the very end, is this whole idea of the incremental approach. You know, is probably what we want to be gunning for, as opposed to having a sea change all at once. Just because that's the practical thing, right? Otherwise, it really doesn't work. Let me just pause to, okay, nobody is raising their hand. So, I mean, more lessons learned. So this on the right is a poster that I made for, just out of the findings of this project that I made for the GDN, that's the Global Development Network Conference in Bonn last year. So just poster format, trying to present. You probably can't see much of the text. So maybe just, again, just using the opportunity to highlight some of the outputs that, you know, came out of the work, or that are coming out of the work. You know, so the goal is, you know, evidence-informed policymaking. And like I said, you know, we don't want to get into politics per se, you know, but it's very useful to understand the politics of policymaking, and there's politics to it. You know, the policy. So on this right, we have this policy cycle thing, which is very, you know, I know that the policy studies literature has moved on a bit from it, you know, but I think in real life, you know, a lot of lay people still hold on to this idea of, you know, the policy cycle. You know, you first set an agenda, you do formulation, you do, you know, like almost like this feedback loop, but actually it's not linear. And so we need to be more flexible in the way that, you know, we try to engage with that whole process. Recognize that it's not linear, it's actually very, very messy. And so, you know, the sort of last 3 points maybe lead me to the second aspect, that which we'll take when, you know, I come back at 3:15, around collaboration and networking. Just a few of my thoughts around that on the back of this project. You know, it's important to really take the long view. I'm sure, you know, Professor Oneke probably mentioned it, people that you're talking to mentioned it. Building trusts and aligning incentives. I think for too long, we have, you know, for lack of a better word, each camp has demonized the other, or at least alienated, you know, at the very least, the other. You know, but it's basically, we have to move on from there and try to see where we have common ground. And there is a lot of common ground, you know, if we engage. You know, And the thing about, I'm not sure if this has been touched on, but at the moment, even in health, to a large extent, at least maybe when it's not emergency health, but even in the public health sector, which is the sector that has gained the most traction in this area, and generally in energy, probably in environmental issues, one of the people that I interviewed for this project was the executive of the Nigerian Academy of Science, and basically, it's just the reality is that, coming from him, coming from other interviews, is that this whole evidence-informed policy making process is still very much supply-led. So supply in the sense that it is researchers, brokers, that are trying to push this agenda. And obviously where we would like to get to is for it to be a bit more collaborative, a bit more, two-way. So not just supply-led, but also demand. So an MDA, with the power to implement, basically says, basically asks for advice, from a scientific perspective on what to do. And that's the ideal, I would, well, when I say the ideal, not to put any values on them, but that would be really nice, right? to have that, I will give an example. I actually forget the order of my slides now for a bit, but I'll give an example of how this has worked out practically on the back of this project, and how that links to a current, project that we're now doing with the REA. And maybe just to sort of say lastly that the engagement is continuous, so the point I made earlier about incremental change, it's not going to be, feeding evidence. And I think, again, a lot of, just globally, the literature has grown a lot, or matured a lot around the term that came directly from, the medical field with all the, RCTs and things. The term that actually came into the social sciences and policy was, evidence-based policy making. And actually, that's when you think back on it, that sounds very, very deterministic. It's more humble. It's humbler and more realistic to say evidence-informed policy making, because it's not your evidence that is going to make the policy, right? It's not your evidence alone. There is no, everywhere in the world, there's no one policy that is based just on the evidence. And so we are saying, evidence-informed, and that evidence-informed idea is, it's a process, it's continuous, it's not a one-off, just say take, in whatever form I take, and then I take it, it's actually more iterative, more collaborative, which we're going to sort of touch on more, when I get back from my 15-minute break, if you don't mind. But I think I will sort of leave, maybe not leave, I want to play a video now, which is one of the outputs from this project. And yeah, I'll play it. It's okay. I mean, when we get back, I'm happy to take maybe questions based on what I presented, and maybe the video before I launch into, the second part is actually not very long. It's quite brief, and I want that to be more interactive. So don't worry, I think we've got enough time to pull that off. But I'll just wait till the end of the video and then leave the room. In the academic world, however, I don't know if you're like me, you start to get a sense of, there has to be more. How can I contribute to the way, to development, especially in a place like Nigeria, where seriously, there's a lot that needs to be done. And so along comes this INGSA call, which was broadly targeted, well, I don't say broadly targeted, broadly aimed at researchers from the global south working on issues in any aspect of the SDGs. So I was working on energy, other people were working on resilience, issues of resilience, disaster risk management, things like that. So 6 of us then got selected globally to basically, as academics, coming from an academic place to try to engage with the world of policy. So the brief was quite broad, so there was a lot of space within which to sort of wiggle in that. So I did that for 1 year. The proposal that I sent was framed as like action research. So yes, we're used to the traditional desk-based research. I'd also done some kind of participatory research work with communities in poor areas, mostly rural ones. But in terms of action research with elite groups, especially politicians or policymakers, this was going to be my first stab at it. So like almost like learning by doing stakeholder engagement, meetings, things like that, interviews, and it was actually a very, very fruitful process. And so it's some of the process and the outcomes that I want to share with us today. So just to say, I'll be keeping my eye on the clock. This is a 2-hour session, but I'd like to actually break it a bit. And I'm aiming to be able to go off for about 15 minutes.
Either biofuels like wood and charcoal.
There's a lot of research that has been done around the issue of household energy poverty, especially cooking energy provision in developing contexts like Nigeria. A lot of research by academics in both in Nigeria and outside of Nigeria. And there's a lot that these discussions can contribute to policy. And there's a lot of scope for government to partner with research institutions, but as well as with all projects that are going on the ground from civil society, donor organizations, as well as the private sector. And so there's a lot of scope for collaboration and partnership. However, government on trying to literally gather people together around the table, recognize the different inputs and perspectives and contributions that each stakeholder can bring to the table, recognize that we can just do things without having a basis for doing them, and that evidence-based research is one of the key tools, potential key tools that can be used to improve the quality of decisions that are made in this sector.
The killer in the kitchen.
Salasi and
government do something sharp. Salasi
Stop it now, or you can. We try to make evidence a useful tool, and I think so this next slide begins to speak to those issues. I think is actually a good way to transition. So here I have as guiding principles of collaboration and networking, ideas around knowledge co-production, transdisciplinary research. These are terms that will be familiar to many academics. And I think the fourth point, about merging different or even divergent cultures. So, and the following point about the incentives. So there's been a lot of work in the policy studies literature, basically just saying, there's no way around aligning the incentives. So what does a politician want? Versus what does a researcher want? A politician or policymaker is not going to do what a researcher says is, right? And it's not just Nigeria, anywhere in the world. if it doesn't also fulfill something that they need or want, and the whole idea of different cultures, different, so in academia, or you are I don't know, you're looking for tenure, you're looking for next publication, you're looking, the metrics by which test are completely different from the metrics by which a policymaker or a politician is is assessed. And so that already begins to create just a gap, so even looking at that, forget about the content of the politics, but politics pervades all things. Forget about whether you think it's good or bad politics. The idea is politics pervades all the politics. Or it's a, so I'll talk a bit, further about another project that we're doing around actually trying to explore out the political economy of energy access in Nigeria. And again, this is sort of like a movement, a small step beyond this whole evidence-informed policymaking to say, okay, even if you have these processes going on to inform, policy, what does that space? What are the actors? What are the potential winners and losers? How is that space constituted? What needs to give for change to happen? If the change happens as a result of the evidence you're producing, who loses? Who potentially loses the next election? Who loses tons of money? Who loses those things? And I said earlier that I don't think that it's our job to, so we have this, the third point about advocacy, honest brokerage. Some would say that actually as a researcher, you don't venture into in fact, even honest brokerage is as a knowledge broker, is that you are sort of creator, right? So that has to be done even with honesty, which means that you are not even standing on any one issue. You're just being a neutral advisor, right? To the extent that is possible. Advocacy is more in line with, say civil society approach, which is like you have a position that you're pushing, because you have this evidence that backs it, and then you're going for it. So those are two possible but different, approaches. So, but the point is, whichever of these things that you do, you're getting into an environment, a political environment. This picture or image on the right was co-produced at the second INGSA workshop, actually facilitated by Professor Oneke, where we, so he took a session where this was produced by all the stakeholders in government, researchers and things, starting to map the landscape, policy landscape, really, in the energy sector. And this you start to get an idea of who is involved, but more than who is involved are the power relations, between them. So I suppose maybe short answer, I realize this is probably not an answer at all. I think it really is just, we do have to engage. We do have to engage because there's no getting around it, right? You can't say, I don't know, you can't say because politics is, the politics of the place is messy and all of that, you will not engage. You engage, but the parameters by which you engage, again, principles of honest brokerage, you are not necessarily, you are there on behalf of the evidence, So there's a sort of joke in academia about policy-based evidence as opposed to evidence-based policy. So policy-based evidence, meaning the evidence itself is influenced by policy or a certain policy perspective, as opposed to evidence being, in quote, neutrally presented to inform, so even evidence and research, the research environment can possibly be corrupted by this political environment if we are not careful. So we do need to understand and engage with the political environment, understand what's in it for policymakers, and it's a long haul. I think I've made these points earlier. Some of them are later. It's a long haul. It's not going to be one-off, right? But it does entail understanding and trying to engage. So let me just give, before I sort of invite the next, just because I think this relates to the question and maybe can shed more light. So I'll try to talk in about 5 minutes about this project. So this project is funded by the Partnership for Policy, and it came like right on the back of my, the INGSA work. How it happened, so there was this call that my center sort of circulated, and the call was very, very specific. Partnership for Economic Policy is the European funders. It was very specific about, proposals. It was inviting proposals that were looking at feeding evidence, feeding in quote evidence into policy, but also done, so the research needed to be done in partnership with policymakers. So you had, it was a very, very specific call, 4 researchers, 2 policymakers. Dr. Moju was also, he was in a past cohort. I think he'll be speaking later, maybe tomorrow or Thursday, I think. So it was also, so he knows about this program. And so the idea is there are 4 researchers and 2 government people, working in a policy or implementing organization. And the idea was the proposal had to be co-produced with them. You had to get approval, i.e. a letter signed by the head of that agency or ministry, and you had to, so even in the application of it had to be, and I mean, note that this is actually an economic or economics-based project. But the value of the work that I did in INGSA was this whole project would not have been possible. This particular one would actually have not been possible if those relationships had not been initiated during the INGSA project. So this was a relationship that had been started like over 1 year. They were the workshops we engaged with. We started sort of having one-on-one interactions in terms of phone calls, interviews, things like that. And so even in terms of knowing the people to engage or even their willingness to engage, by the end of the second workshop, it was that the REA had started make statements. They started making statements around like, oh, just showing, okay, now they see the value of pursuing an evidence sort of based approach. However, having said that this project came to be at all, is probably nothing short of a miracle for people who believe in miracles, rather, because even at that point, at that time, it was almost thwarted. All of this, with all the relationship building, it was almost thwarted by political issues with the agency. In fact, I had like literally put my hands up. I'm like, I don't care about your policy. Let's just get on with the work. I don't care about your, you pitting yourselves against each other. I mean, I don't know. That's the way that it seemed to an outsider. And this is not to say that this is the way it seemed to an outsider. And I guess those of us coming from outside of government, we don't understand the government work. And very nearly, the proposal was submitted, I don't know, 5 minutes before the closing, because the signatures were being withheld by politically police interest within the agency that they necessarily want to see and all of that. But we engaged, and I think even just engaging, after starting the project, there are those issues. So, answer, those political issues will never go away. They're not going to go away. What gets implemented, funding for implementation, what gets implemented, it's also, every step of the way. It's about people pushing agenda. It's about we as researchers, our interest is the evidence. What does the evidence say? And the more we're presented at the table, the more we also push the evidence agenda. It is inherently a political process, and maybe that's so. It's almost like you have to get into the fray without I don't know, compromising yourself or something. I mean, that's not to say a lot of it again just comes from understanding And many times you realize that it's because we don't understand how things work. We don't understand the incentives. You know, we don't understand what motivates people in those settings. And so it is very much a learning sort of learning process. Yeah, I don't know if that speaks to the question. But yeah, that's it. Okay, I'm not sure. Does anyone else? Sorry, I stopped there because I wanted other people to also contribute.
Hello, this is Dedeke on the line. Dedeke speaking.
Okay.
Okay, Dr. Thank you so much, Dr. Temilade, for what you just said. It just reminds me of what Professor Aneke, when he was presenting yesterday, he was talking about the issue of, especially when he was talking about systems, that policy has to be viewed in the form of systems. And I remember that system loop that he showed. And there is that complexity of the system, of that loop, that causal loop. There is this, of course, you can see the direction in which the thing is going, the main direction, but there are offshoots of other cycles, other loops, coming from it that you can trace around each of the main points in that causal loop. And I think that is what we are discussing now, actually, really, that we are looking at the system. And it's a system that is not straightforward, it's a complex system. And then you now Nigeria into the mix of our discussion. I am sure we know that it's even more complex than probably what some other people will face outside of Nigeria in terms of guidance, in the risk, and so on and so forth. We will admit that it's more complex than well, I've not lived else before. I've only traveled there. I have not lived there. I won't say that I really know what they are going through in terms of challenges. But I know that in Nigeria here, in terms of challenges, it's enormous. And everybody is good at those problems most of the time. So when we now throw that list of what we are causing, evidence-based, sometimes you go out there, you want to get evidence for this, to the same set of people. You see some set of people, they are ready to truncate it, just for you to give them something. Okay. For example, I have a younger sister who is Kindle Africa, who is working with indigent people in Epeya, trying to help women, young women, and so on, and teaching them. Many times they will meet with the touts or the warlord in that area who are ready to block anything that they wanted to do. So there's always all that problem there. So it's not just funding alone. It is possible for you to have funding and for you not to have taken note of those warlords, those stakeholders, and then they can thwart all that you have been doing for hymns, and they are ready to just throw it down. So it's a complex, it's tied together, and the lesson we are learning is that policy making, interacting with the stakeholders, researchers, policymakers, and so on is a big and complex thing. But we can write through, we can solve the problem. That's the way I see it. That's what I am. That's what's just coming to my mind. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much. That's very useful. Does anyone else want to? I'm trying to look for raised hands or. Okay, people are mostly silent. I was hoping for a more interactive. It could be like your experiences, like Mr. Lideke just said, or anything, your reflections on what, on what we have been saying. Let me go back to some prompts I had. About, in your experience, which mediums have appealed the most to policymakers? Maybe your experience of trying to influence policy, either as a researcher or a practitioner, and what has worked. Maybe if anybody has any experience in that regard. Okay. No problem. Let's move. So on the third point, what synergies do researchers need to build to amplify their influence? That's actually something that I tackle. There's a paper, the academic paper out of these days. Everybody blames everything on COVID, so I'm going to blame this delay on COVID as well. It would have been published by now, possibly, if not for COVID, because it's in the last days for revision. Yeah, sort of struggling to find space to do that. But anyway, it's something that I tackle in that paper, and I think it's important, in this context. Mr. Dedeket said something about challenges being higher potentially here than elsewhere. I don't know. I would say at least they're different. At least at the very least they're different. Whether higher or lower. And one of the challenges, is the low of research. So one of the things that struck me as a student of sociology in the UK, for instance, while I was doing my doctorate, was the idea of, and I was doing this in a science and technology studies school, was the idea of science as a culture in a place like the West. So basically, even among the general population, people say, oh, the sciences. In fact, they are not allowed to put out adverts, with misleading claims. Something scientifically clinically proven. That's a well-used phrase. Clinically proven to remove 99.9% of pimples in 3 days. You can't make such claims unless they are backed by rigorous trials and things like that. But also the way that the public, engage with, science. So science is seen as people make reference to science. In many ways, the only parallel that I can see, in a place like, a culture would be the way that we make reference to religion. So you're citing something, you're citing the basis for doing something. Here, people defer to, things like religious beliefs and, ordinances. I would say that the closest thing to that in the West would be science. And so already science does have an elevated status in those places, than here. And so that makes this enterprise a very, very more uphill than it would be in a place where already the baseline for recognition of science as, as valuable, or as having the last word on anything. And so it's really important for me, this question, that in this kind of context, then how do you then amplify the influence of researchers and research, in the policy making space? I think beyond the actual inputs that we make, it goes to a deeper a deeper level of values. What inputs do you value? What do you value research as? Do you take research as or research evidence as something, as law almost, as binding? If this is the latest science on something, do you value it, kind of value that you place on it? And so that's important. Let me just go to, I can see at least 2 people with their hands raised. I'm sorry, before Montserrat Banire, somebody raised their hand. I didn't get the name. Can you please raise your hand again? But I'll let Montserrat speak now. Montserrat, please go on. Okay, I don't see the hand anymore.
Thank you very much. I was having problem with the connection. I didn't raise my hand actually to raise any hand.
Okay.
Thank you.
No problem. So yes, that's something that I think collectively as a community of researchers, you know, and also policymakers, you know, to sort of see how this role can be amplified, especially so you have a sector that's research that is underfunded. Again, you know, you can't deny the value of money funding in these things. So almost as a matter of course, you know, actors that are better funded and can, you know, quote unquote lobby better for representation in policy making, decision making processes will be privileged, you know. So okay, I've spoken a bit about this, and so yeah, the main point, I think why I put this slide here is, you know, if you notice, I'm not even the PI on this project, you know, I'm one of the researchers. The PI is an economist, because it's an economics based, you know, that's not my core discipline, but I'm there for the policy and the translation of those economic findings into policy. So we begin to see issues of multidisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, working, you know, even beyond academia with other stakeholders to do that. So sort of when I put this slide, I had some of the things that are coming out. Many of us hopefully you know about something like the Conversation Africa. That's also one way we spoke earlier about how to break some of these messages down. I find the Conversation a very good platform to do that. So you have already, you can break it down into journalistic form, and it's not, I think it's 800 to 1,000 words. But then you have to think of who the audience is. So maybe this would be more of an international audience. I don't know how many of our policymakers read the Conversation Africa, but you know, who knows? There may be ways to highlight how to raise the profile of these outlets nationally as well. Okay, project that I'm working on now, based on again, still arising in many ways from the INGSA project. To then sort of do the next step, you know, of engagement, we sort of got funding from ICDs. You know, one of the directors spoke in the I think this all speaks to the importance of practice, right? So between researchers, well, I think one of the last slides is about something to do with civil society, and I think especially in a place where I don't know, researchers don't have a lot of leverage or support. I think civil society is a natural ally, you know, at least those organizations that are, you know, working in the same direction, you know, and so because they also have this advocacy and they have been in this trying to, in a different way, but they've been in this trying to influence agendas business for much longer than local researchers have been, and I think there's a lot to be gained from synergies. So this was a proposal that was, you know, developed by ICID, which is a non-governmental organization, but because of, and I've been working on these issues, you know, for a while. So because on the back of those engagements that we had on the INGSA project, we are then saying, okay, so we have spoken, right, and we have done workshops. That the PEP project was supposed to make this whole idea more concrete, you know, in a sense. Now this one is actually more direct. So the Ministry of the Environment, you know, is trying to include, so actually now bypassing you know, the Energy Commission and other like usual suspects for clean cooking, and actually including clean cooking in its NDC strategies, the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. And so basically trying to get climate funding into the clean cooking sector. And this initiative was taken by the Federal Ministry of the Environment, who, you know, were part of the deliberations, you know, anyway. And, you know, this speaks of attribution, you know. I will never be able to say 100%, you know, whether that the engagements factored into, but again, they've been engaging with ICID for years, even before I did that. I engaged with IC through the project, and they together we engaged, on INGSA. And so it's a sort of continuing conversation. Now this is the next step. There's potentially a pot of money available to develop this clean cooking solutions program to reach 10 million households. So now this project that started actually in July is to sort of build a case. There are several work packages. I'm working on work package 1, which is one of the work packages, which is literally understanding the political economy of cooking energy access in Nigeria. And so yeah, by looking to the end of 2020 to see what can come out of that. So so two good things here: potentially money coming in, and then the fact that this agenda is actually owned by a ministry, Federal Ministry of the Environment. And just a note here that I don't know, may have come out from Professor Oneke's presentation, but also, yeah, it's implied in my presentation as well today, that we can't discount the role of champions, like individual champions, even within NDs, as we try to push for, the recognition of certain evidence or, evidence as a whole. And this ministry in particular has a couple of champions actually that have been, that align with these agendas that we're trying to promote, just my INGSA work, and again, the community of practice generally, that align with them. So you can name names. You can name, the Department of Climate Change within this ministry specifically has, just a couple of champions who, in speaking to what's in it for them, it may not even be the official line of the ministry, but they themselves, and so the campaign, or they work for the success of that agenda within the ministry because they are personally aligned, with that agenda. So that's another strand to it. And so, we have a couple of champions here that have raised the profile of this and putting this into the NDC agenda. So short answer. Attribution is difficult, what I think that engagement and all those outputs, started a journey that is ongoing, and yeah, I think it's leading to a potentially good place. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay. Awesome. So I think this is the last slide. I think this is a fitting place for me to finish. I think I've got just a couple minutes more. So this, I've been talking about civil society. I have found in my work, like I said, civil society to be really woke. If I can say that. But of course, maybe not every single CSO, but there are key ones that are really woke. And so I got this quote from somebody working, well, yeah, again, just confidentiality. So this is somebody working within an NGO that actually advises members, just parliament, basically legislators and things. And this is a direct quote from what one of the interviews we did. It says, "I think the language and manner of approach to policymakers is important. When you talk of the weight of the evidence, it's about how you present it, right? The strategy for presentation is quite important. So we need to change the rules of engagement. Those are the things that get people to listen, to look at facts in the first place. We like to talk about facts, evidence. But if people are not even looking at you, you're on your own. Because if you don't catch my attention to look at something, there is no way you can convince me." So this particular NGO works a lot behind the scenes to influence, not necessarily just in the area of energy. In fact, at the time that I did this interview with them, they weren't hardly doing any energy work. They just done a couple of reports or something. But they work more broadly, things like just democracy, justice, good governance, female, women's empowerment, female representation in parliament, things like that. But what strikes me about them is the approach, the patient approach. They are really playing a long game. Also, contrary to a lot of the, I don't know, maybe more grassroots civil society that we know, they're actually quite non-confrontational as well. So they don't go to government, you know, you're not doing this, you're not doing that. They actually, there's a lot of, you know, just trying to influence things both directly and indirectly, you know, through if they're trying to get something across to, you know, in terms of, you know, their own evidence. Again, not necessarily, you know, research, scientific evidence. They do have research arms, but again, bear in mind this is an NGO, not necessarily an academic.
Sesan, your time is up. We really need
is.
to go. We have to stop at 4, and we're supposed to do 5 minutes reflection.
We are okay.
Yes.
That's fine.
We really have
yeah.
to go now. Yeah.
I see someone has cancelled my slide, and yeah, that's it. So I think the text actually speaks for itself, and yes, so we close with that.
Okay. Thank you very